Okay, we're on air. Kirsty Kitto, thanks very much for joining us. Leo Gaggle, thanks very much for joining us. We're all talking about data, specifically extracting data from a targeted YouTube network, if that's possible, and what we might do with that. And no doubt our conversation will touch on broader issues to do with ownership and power of data and all of that sort of thing. But Leo, you've introduced us. Could you start us off? What is it you do, and why you think we should all meet?
Look, personally, we obviously had a discussion along the Experience API technology for quite a while, and once we met in Melbourne last time, we were talking about collecting social network data, basically trawling social network for public data and then storing it in an LRS for learning analytics and other purposes. And I met Kirsty a fair while ago, last year, I think, at one of the Experience API events, and I knew that she had done a lot of that work already with the Connected Learning Toolkit. So that's why I thought, rather than inventing the wheel, go straight to the source and have a discussion about that.
Thank you, Leo. Kirsty, tell us about the Connected Learning Toolkit.
Yeah, so this is a project that's funded by the OLT, so the Office of Learning and Teaching, and it's been going for about a year and a half now. And so the idea of the toolkit is we take data from various social media by interfacing with their standard APIs, and then we aggregate the data in xAPI format, and then we'll develop sort of contextualized dashboards that feed off of that data. And give students, academics, different people access to different reports depending on what their sort of pedagogical needs are and what they've actually designed into their learning experiences. So at the moment, in terms of data collection, we can pull in data from things like Twitter. We use YouTube comments at the moment for reasons we'll no doubt go into. We also use Facebook. We can use, we've got someone just integrating with Trello, so project management tools. What else? And a lot of Wordpress. So we're quite good at pulling in data from Wordpress, Buddypress type setups and things like that. And so the underlying reason we're trying to pull in these kinds of data sources is we've got a strong cohort of teachers at QUT who don't like using the learning management system. And so our standard learning management system is Blackboard, and people aren't very happy with it. And so what you'll find is the people who want to try quite new, innovative things have sort of been off doing their own thing for a long time. And the reasoning behind this grant when we put it in was, well, these are the people who are likely to be very innovative with learning analytics. So these are the people who are really trying to push boundaries in terms of trying new things, engaging students in quite authentic learning experiences and trying to get them really engaging in quite strong connected learning experiences. So these are the guys that we should really be targeting and providing services for. And so we put in the grant, got a decent amount of money. It's a quite large grant, so we're working with people so we've got Shane Dawson at UNSW on the grant, Simon Buckingham Shum, who's at Sydney UTS, Abelardo Pardo, who's at Sydney Uni, and then we've got Dragan Gasevic, who's come in via UNSW, but he's at Edinburgh, and George Siemens as well is on the grant. So there's a strong cohort of external learning analytics people who've been giving us a lot of feedback and advice and encouragement as we've developed, but the core of the development's been going on at QUT. So a lot of the project has been developed. Well, a lot of the tools have been developed by students. So we had things up and running as student projects before I got the money, just to see if xAPI would work at all. And there's quite a learning curve to starting to use xAPI for the first period because it's quite a sloppy specification for a data standard. So you can do a lot in it, and you can do a lot wrong with it as well.
That's a nice technical term you use there, sloppy.
Well, it's the specification itself is not sloppy, but there's a lot you can do wrong with it. It doesn't force you to do a lot, like, so it's very very underspecified effectively in terms of what it forces you to do.
Okay.
There is a lot of work going on in the xAPI community now about using things like linked data to actually get a lot of that stuff more well developed. So, for example, have either of you come across the Companion Specification for xAPI vocabularies? So that was released maybe months ago, and that gives a lot of advice and a lot of extra sort of specification on top of the basic spec, which starts to actually enforce things like vocabularies and profiles and structures. So a lot of the challenges we had with getting the toolkit up and running is, if you think about social media, a tweet might be very similar to a Facebook post in terms of the underlying semantics, and so you need to be very careful about how you represent those two things, because really you'd like to be able to unify the description so you can do a higher level aggregation, but you don't want to aggregate things together that it doesn't make sense to aggregate. So we spent a lot of time sort of mapping out what we were calling a connected learning recipe as a data specification within xAPI. So that's essentially a profile is what they're called now under the spec. But essentially what it is sort of a syntax and semantics that we're using for connected learning using social media. So we essentially just extend that data structure as we go with the development. But I'm even moving to Trello, and we've got a GitHub integration that's been going on as well. So these kinds of collaborative content authoring, project management type things tend to require a whole extra specification. So there's a whole set of data structures, recipes, and profiles that we've had to be kind of developing as we went. So that's been interesting.
The second one, Kirsty, have you actually put that one up on GitHub? I mean, we've been actually reusing your connected learning recipe, the social side of things, for some integration that we've done with Known and some WordPress stuff. But what you mentioned with Trello and the project management tool, has that been shared in that way as well?
So we haven't uploaded that yet,
okay.
So that's just in development. The Trello functionality is just going online probably this week. So we've got a class that wants to use it next week. So we're in a bit of a mad dash trying to get that up. Mm-hmm. The GitHub one, the recipe has been extended, but we just need to actually do a bit of work to make sure that we're happy with that spec before we release. But yeah, all of that will be going up. One thing I do want to actually start moving towards is some good mappings of the data structures in terms of this new companion specification, so the recipe can get a bit more well implemented than it currently is. We weren't even really sure when we were doing it if it was a recipe. So it took a while for us to get up to speed in terms of what a recipe is and what it means, and how they can be used with best practice in the community. And the companion spec actually does a really good job laying all of that out much more clearly. So that was a really nice contribution that came out just recently.
Kirsty, can you speak to some examples that you've been deploying this in at QUT? Like, I don't imagine the teachers are too up to speed, given that they're not happy with Blackboard, or not necessarily only because of Blackboard, but I don't imagine they're up to speed with the in-depth knowledge of how to connect these data sets together and how to put them out. They'd be depending on you and your team to come up with something to then run on their setup. So could you talk us about those setups that you're running these in, and what sort of things you're looking at?
Yeah, so one of the big users, Kate Davis, she normally uses a WordPress plus sort of Buddypress setup for pretty much any of her classes. She's very good at rolling them out for herself. And one of her big nightmares is her classes are very much judged or marked in terms of participation components. So students need to essentially do a blogging exercise, for example, for the class that they're in last semester, and they need to be going and commenting on each other's blogs and interacting and forming a community. And so that's, you can imagine, quite a nightmare to sit through and assess in terms of, you know, how well someone contributed to the community. So what we've got for the dashboards, as we've currently got them, they roll out automatically for whatever social media that person is using. So we've essentially, when we set up classes, when we set up her install, we essentially just turn on WordPress plus Twitter, which then gives her access to the data aggregated for Twitter and WordPress. So there's activity reports, there's social network analysis, there's a bit of content analysis, and then there's a few other kind of weird things that we're playing with in terms of getting students to go and look at how a classifier has classified their behaviour. So correcting the classifier is the basic idea around that, because essentially what you'll find when you do, when you train a classifier off of, you need to train it off of a data set, and this one in particular was trained off of a Moodle data set from Canada that was doing computer science, and so when you try to use the same, use a classifier that you've trained off of that data set, it's not going to be as accurate. And so we've been playing around with the concept of getting students to kick back and fight back against the classifications. So actually think about how they've been classified and to actually correct it. Okay. Which is, there's a whole interesting set of issues that go around there. So I gave a talk at UNSW a couple of months ago, that's online somewhere, about is imperfect analytics actually more useful from a pedagogical perspective than perfect analytics? So if you just tell someone that they are something, that doesn't really give them much chance to actually think about that and to actually interact with that and to actually think about whether maybe they want to be a little bit different. So potentially if you're showing a student something and saying it's not perfect, you should maybe think about it and question it and challenge it. Potentially that's actually a more pedagogically useful device. Mm. But this is a very new argument that we're just trying to actually really sort our way through.
Oh, really? So you're getting some pushback to the idea of equal access to that dashboard so that a student can negotiate the meaning that the machines or the program is making out of it?
Yeah, so you don't even need equal access so much as you need an interface that students can understand and interact with, and the pedagogical purpose of that would then be stronger if they're not just going, oh, I'm someone who just triggers. So this classifier is a communicative inquiry cognitive presence classifier, so essentially it tells students that their posts are being seen as triggering or exploring or integrating or resolving an issue or other. So if somebody, sort of looks at the classifier, how it categorized their posts and goes, oh, I'm being seen as someone who's triggering a lot, do I agree with that? Well, actually, I thought all of these other posts were really good examples of integration, and actually then goes through and actually really thinks about that. Then that actually, the hope is that will actually encourage them towards more sophisticated online interactions. Mm. So this is actually something we're going to really actively try with her class this semester. So we're actually doing an intervention at week 2 where we teach them about this communicative inquiry framework and what it means, and then get them to actually go and engage with the tool and hopefully sort of move them towards a much more, or a much richer interaction in that online environment. So the same cohort last year, we were using the toolkit a bit with them last year. They were quite shallow in terms of their interactions, so they have a tendency to kind of, they were doing a lot of tweeting in that class, so they had fortnightly actually, Twitter chats, and they were doing a lot of talking, but they weren't really conversing. They were kind of just talking past each other almost. So we're going to try and push them into a more sophisticated interaction that way.
Like in cross-blogging or comments within blogs?
So these ones in particular, the main forum for communication was Twitter last year, but it's the sort of teaching delivery has been a little bit redesigned, so it'll be a bit more intensively dependent upon the blogging, and then the Twitter communication channel will be set up as a much broader communication channel, so they got a bit trapped by the
Kirsty, in terms of the Twitter data that you're pulling in, is it largely based on hashtags, or are you pulling in a whole feed for a particular user account?
No, just the hashtags. So for us, in terms of the ethics of it, I don't feel very comfortable pulling in all their tweets, but also just in terms of the learning usefulness of it, their entire conversation just makes not much sense. Like, it's not useful educationally. So we're trying to walk a
WordPress
fairly
as
fine line. Sorry?
Sorry, Kirsty, jumping in. Do you use do you draw in hashtags on WordPress as well?
Not at the current functionality. So WordPress, we just use that particular site. So we won't use the whole install that they're interacting with. So essentially, there'll be a particular component of WordPress that we pull in, set up by the educator in that context. So essentially, what happens for the toolkit is educators will have to design some sort of a learning scenario that they want to pull the data in for. And we only pull the data in for that specific scenario, so students sort of have a fair bit more privacy than is commonly going on in social media at the moment. So, and that's just from a fairly firm belief that I've got, that this stuff needs to be much more carefully controlled, and especially when you're looking at education, students are doing a whole heap of other stuff that they wouldn't feel very happy about giving educators access to, and quite rightly too.
Or indeed the wider internet.
Yes.
So you were able to run this system in closed off environments in WordPress, set up with WordPress, for example, as well as...
So these WordPress installs are open, but we're only taking the data from that specific. So, for example, the information programs class, which was set up by Kate for her particular class. Right. So we won't take any of the rest of her WordPress install because she hasn't signed that up to the toolkit.
Yeah.
And in fact, we're only tracking the blogs from the students for that one as well, and that's a bit to do with how Buddypress is set up more than anything else.
So, Leo, what about an example from your end with Bright Cookie? You're also working with LRS and xAPI. Have you got some examples, or are you still monitoring the scene and wondering where you might step in on this?
No, we have certainly got a few areas where we have actually actively used the xAPI technology now. I mean, we've started about 2 years ago developing our own LRS that we've open sourced under a similar license as Moodle, because we see it used with in existing clientele with LMSs and other feeder systems. We had the similar challenges that Kirsty was facing in terms of corporately sanitized, I call it flexibility rather than sloppiness, but so it's a very flexible standard rather than the prescriptive standard that we're coming from the SCORM environment. So the examples that we have used, I mean, are largely integration projects. I mean, one of the advantages for the xAPI being basically a large data store behind the scenes, and that it really makes it really easy to feed in data from various feeder systems. It's actually a really nice way of integrating foreign systems, which is other. So we've used it as a reporting engine for example, multiple hospitals. There's a large-scale project that deals with blood collection safety across hospitals. So a lot of staff from all Australian hospitals actually has to do the course, but the reporting has been a real challenge. So we have to use the xAPI behind the scenes for something like that. The other area that we have been using it is in professional development environments. So corporates have generally got corporates and member-driven organizations usually have a problem with tracking PD hours because they can happen wherever. I mean, it might be a seminar attendance or something like that happens outside. So really, that's a larger project that we're doing here and with a South Australian enterprise client, and we're doing more and more work similar to Kirsty, and where we've actually used some of her recipes in terms of integrating with WordPress. We integrate as well, but that is largely more on the xAPI content. So we have clients that create learning content in authoring tools that are xAPI compliant, and then just delivering the content in WordPress that way is basically just a cut down LMS environment, but we are using it for on a more social context with Totara Social. I'm not sure if you guys heard about that. It's actually a corporate version of Mahara ePortfolio, where we've done this for an enterprise project up in the Northern Territory, where there's very distributed users that wanted to basically have learning content tracked, but without the formality of an LMS. So it's more a basically mapped content repository that users can then do more self-service, but it still then ties together from a professional development perspective what content they've actually looked at and what work they have actually done in that environment.
That sounds ideal for a more distributed and connected learning environment. So if I may, I might describe the project, even though on email I've already described it, but for this record, describe the project we're on, and if you don't mind, you could relate to your experiences and where they might relate and how you might be able to help us. We are leading a project in our School of Fashion where they are interested in the proposition we've made, where we sort of stopped thinking about YouTube as the typical error that people make as a broadcast channel. I'm a teacher or I'm a school and this is our formal channel and you watch these videos that we put up. And what we're trying to do instead is to create a distributed network in YouTube to begin with. By that I mean encouraging teachers to set up their own YouTube channels and subscribe to their department channel if that needs to exist, and that department channel then subscribes to the school channel, and alongside those teachers they subscribe to each other's channels, and then their students subscribe to the teachers' channels. So the thinking is that on that basis we have from the school out to the students and alumni quite a large footprint across YouTube in terms of the connectedness of the channels. And then exercises like, well, one of the things we've got as a buzzword is saying, can we teach YouTube to teach? So one of the things we did last week or the week before last week, we sat down with a student cohort, a small group of about 20, who were expected to subscribe to the footwear channel, Andrew Robinson's Footwear YouTube channel. They're learning how to make shoes in a year. And one of the things we did is we got them in a lab environment. We said, we've all used YouTube, so let's have a look at your YouTube channels. Now, before doing that, we discussed whether or not we want to use our personal YouTube channels or start a new channel. And then even that, do we start a new channel within the RMIT account environment, or do we start a new channel out in, or a new account out there in Google World? And then when we did that, we looked at the mostly fresh new channels, and typically the fresh new channel homepages had funny cat videos and celebrity videos and propaganda. And so what we then did is ask them to subscribe to the teacher's channel as their only action. Subscribe to the teacher's channel. Now let's look at the homepage. And almost instantaneously everything had changed in the homepage. Footwear making videos were being recommended. Then we asked the student who was interested in cowboy boots, in a particular type of cowboy boot. Okay, let's see if we can find one and watch one. Now look at your homepage, your YouTube homepage, and naturally that's starting to shape and the links and recommendations and associations being made by YouTube. So the question for us is, can we devise activities to encourage students and teachers to do to make their YouTube accounts richer and more connected and associated with relevant content and less distracting content? And along the way, can we establish a professional online community in this YouTube that will go with them after they've graduated? So it might be that we can help them build up a very useful YouTube channel that is very useful to them after that, while they're studying and after they've studied and graduating, where they can go and reliably pull in instructional videos and informative videos around a whole range of footwear-related things and anything else for that matter. So obviously the skill developed here is immediately transferable. If they want to start up a small business, the same skills apply in creating a business channel, or if they want to set up a campaign, a public community campaign, they can do the same thing. So you get the idea. So the question is, you know, what do we need to can we, what sort of data can we extract from a network? We've got a teacher's channel and all the students that are subscribed. So there is, we've got this little network within YouTube that we potentially can identify all the agents in. And then what sort of data can we extract from that to get some sort of meaning and indication of how healthy or how well this network is generating? And then a longitudinal view would be great to set up for that sort of thing as well. Over to you guys. I think. What do you think about that?
I think it's a really good idea, and I think especially in that context it really does need to be in the wild, because effectively this is giving them a footprint that they can use as a portfolio of evidence for getting jobs or for building up client bases. Potentially they can start getting business out of it if they're doing certain things while they're at school still. So one of the things we've been finding with YouTube is because Google essentially owns the API, it can be tricky. It sounds to me like you might be able to get the data you want for this particular use case. So the problem we have with YouTube for the toolkit is that you don't have to be subscribed, essentially. You don't have to be logged in to be watching videos. And so when you're looking at things like views and likes and things like that, which is the kind of thing that a lot of staff members up here actually really want to know about. So, you know, if a student puts on a video, how many people like that video? That kind of stuff is actually quite difficult to track, whereas you're in a much more controlled scenario where to subscribe to a channel you'll have to be logged on, so the API should give you access to that kind of information. But Google API can be very restrictive, so it can change quite a bit as well. So it can be very difficult to build stable tools off of it.
Well, what we've discovered just quickly on that is we can log in. That teacher's channel is a channel that's shared management, and I have a management status on that channel as well. And when we go in to look at the data, that's pretty rich. You know, we can get on a day-by-day, month-by-month, year-by-year basis of who's subscribed or what accounts have subscribed, etc., etc. Or it can be actually one accounts, might be numbers of subscriptions over a period of time. But so I'm not sure if we can have a system that can we log in to YouTube on that, and then it has access to all of that data.
Well, so the problem will be, do you want to track, for example, in a social network, who is subscribed to whose channel? So if you want to be building up those kinds of network relationships, then you'll need to have both parties in terms of both nodes. But you can't obviously subscribe to a channel without saying who you are, and you also have to subscribe to, like, you know, that channel belongs to someone. So potentially you can get all of that information. What we did with the toolkit for the so we had an analysing demonstration. So this was the Australian Learning Analytics Summer Institute, where we set up a YouTube channel, and we got some learning analytics videos posted from, say, solar videos and things like that. And then we got people in the workshop to prepare for the workshop by watching videos, leaving comments about essentially the ethics and privacy of learning analytics and stuff like that. And then what we could do from there is build essentially a social network off of the interactions that have been happening in the channel. So we could do some content analysis about essentially themes that were being discussed. So obviously ethics and privacy was one of the themes that showed up. Then we had things like a social network that we could show forming as different people subscribed to the as different people actually just left comments to the channel. This was I can't remember if it was a private channel or not. No, it's publicly available, I think. So essentially all of the stuff that we set up for that relied upon. Essentially we only pulled in comments if people had signed up to the toolkit. So people could go into that channel and leave comments, but that data wouldn't come in. So there's a bit of, there'll always be data missing in these kinds of in the wild scenarios. So it depends on how complete you want your data set to be.
Well, in terms of the focus group that we're looking at, the convenience sample, if you like, the teacher and their immediate students right now, then that sort of selected data, self-selected data, is good, because naturally we'll get comments or likes from people outside of that immediate network, which is important to know about. But at the moment, we really want to focus in a bit what Leo was saying. We want to focus in on, here is this cohort of people, how are they interacting, to what level and depth.
Yep.
You know, their view times even, you know, has this student or this person watched the video for its entirety, or only generally watching the videos for the first few minutes.
So that's where you may run into trouble with the API. So we've had trouble getting that information out of the API, but we haven't, well, every time we look into it, it changes. So, you know, maybe it's better now.
There is ways of capturing that. I mean, there is a iFrame YouTube player URI, so if you can force the playing of the videos from your RMIT page via an iFrame, then you can certainly capture that kind of data.
Okay, so what you mean by that is to put the video in a website by the iFrame?
Yeah, or actually create a player that people can still publish their videos in YouTube in their channels, but then a player app that pulls it all together into a web page that has an iFrame embedded, that we can then capture the interactions with that iFrame. So we can then, when I say we, whoever writes the code behind the scenes could then capture things like playing events, how much of the video's been skipped or watched or stopped and started. The other information that you mentioned before, it's something that we have been interacting with, but there were some changes. Google used to make this data available via just some kind of API token, which is a relatively straightforward way of doing this. In the version 3 of the Google API, all of this has to be via an OAuth process, basically meaning a live exchange of tokens, which makes things a little bit more challenging. But yeah, we have fortunately from our end, we had to do that with a couple of the Google integrations that we've done with authentication between LMSs and all that kind of stuff with the Google login. So a fair bit of that stuff we had to do for other things. We haven't really done this in an xAPI context, but for example, the stuff that you can get access to is then the users' favorites, watch lists, subscriptions, recent activity, uploads, and all that kind of scenario. If the channel owner has actually authorized the app that you would have to create to access that data.
See, look, when we talk about somewhat even access to this, we can potentially involve the students in learning about their interactions for future use. So we say to the cohort, just as you observed, Kirsty, what you learn in this project might be very useful for you when you want to set up a business or try and promote your business or products in YouTube. So in this immediate little group, it's worth turning on the permissions for this app now for this particular exercise. And let's see if we can learn what sort of videos have what sort of influence on your network size. Or I'm wondering if, in the back of my mind, I'm wondering if we need to connect it up with some more qualitative statements, like that exercise I described where we start a new channel and we've got funny cat videos and celebrity videos, and you rate this, you know, in terms of professional relevance. How relevant is this channel? 1 to 5, and you put 1, and then watch one video, do that exercise. Watch that one video now, say, on a scale of 1 to 5. So we sort of get another data building over the top here, saying after doing these sorts of exercises, we're getting this value statement from the user, and underneath it all is all of this automatically generated data to compare it against. Is there a way to, in your current system, to set up that kind of user value statement?
In our system, or?
Yeah, sorry, yes.
So what we can do with YouTube at the moment for the toolkit is pull in comments. So that we were very interested in text analysis, and API was moving too fast to be bothered with dealing with the views and stuff. So Leo's quite right. Like pulling into another environment will give you the information like that. But it's messy in terms of it loses the in the wild kind of characteristic, which is what is kind of the whole point of our project. So we've essentially left that stuff alone because we're not looking at it. So Abelardo Pardo has a Python-based environment, which is sort of this little lightweight LMS that he's set up for himself, and that gives him all of the clickstream data for everything in his environment. So he runs that with his Sydney engineering students for a big first-year class. And potentially, and again, it's that same sort of scenario as what Leo described. You can pull in all of the watches and the views of the videos from that environment. So this is potentially another environment that we're thinking about using for that information, because people want it all the time. So it is a problem. Like it's a very common request. Who watched my video? One of the things we've been thinking about a lot in terms of things like comments would be memes. So let's say, if, one of the classic learning designs you'd be wanting to maybe sort of play around with for something like this would be, if I set up this meme, how many people does start using it in some way? So, that kind of impact. And I think from a sort of business sense, that's a really interesting kind of thing to try and get students thinking about. So, how many people did my idea spread to? And how could I track that? So we're playing with reports for another context. I think this one was with Twitter. So if you had a class that were all given a bit of a quick activity that they had to generate a meme, spread it somehow, and then have a competition for whose meme spread furthest, how would they track that? And I could see that maybe being quite an interesting way you could be using that. But you're going to be having, you're going to be having trouble just using the native Google API for this. You're going to have to use something else.
Leo, is that potentially, and what's the size of the work involved? Is that potentially a plugin on the browser that I turn on, or an app that I run on my phone? So instead of the YouTube app, this sample of people agree to use this particular app. For all intents and purposes, it runs the same as a YouTube app, but it just has this other little bit in there that tracks a lot more. And if I'm working on a computer, I install this plugin on my browser, and I know that it's basically tracking a lot more of my use in terms of YouTube. Would that be the other thing, rather than actually embedding things into a website and therefore taking people out of the native environment, keeping people in the YouTube environment for all its distractibility and usability issues, but tracking it sort of over the top by the browser or the app that's running it?
Yeah, I mean, by running it in an app or in a browser app, you probably take them out of the YouTube environment as such. So the way I was going down the track in terms of allowing a server-side interception via the Google API. So the user only has to agree for that server application to be able to access their data once, and then that application can then collect the data from that user, the data that the student has given access to, via the server side. So there would be no browser side interaction other than when you talk about the player app, the iFrame player app, that does involve obviously the browser end. So that's the difference there. One thing that I thought is worth mentioning with when you're talking about Experience API and the LRS, it only helps you with a collection of the data. That's only one part of it. You actually then have to make sense of the data, and that is a lot more challenging. And there's a lot less tools out of the box that can. I mean, that's where I'm going to spend most of my research time over the next 12 months to actually see what's out there and see what we can pull together to create more standardized tools. I'll be interested to see what you're using there, Kirsty, on some of that. There's a few toolkits out there, learning analytics toolkits, but they tend to, or network analysis toolkits, that tend to be very generic, and none of them dealing with xAPI based data. So that's a challenge you have to take into account, and then actually mapping your user surveys, the ones that you were talking about, where you basically take a sample before the use of the channel, and then another survey sample after. These time-based data, all of the data is easily storable in the LRS. Making sense out of all of that across a distributed and not cohesive cohort is going to be more of a challenge.
So on that note, we are aiming to hold a data hack here in Melbourne RMIT on late October, where we're drawing in this little data set along with Melbourne City Council. I think it's fairly famous for its open data, and we're trying to collect attractive data sets with and we haven't begun yet now approaching people here in Melbourne who would draw others around them to make a data hack successful. But is there potential, do you think, in a 2-day data hack that we could really try and get something that can
visualization?
Yeah, something like that, yeah.
So I think absolutely. So I completely agree with Leo. One of the things that has been a constant source of amusement for me in the xAPI community is everybody seems to go in and build an LRS, and an LRS is a very boring thing to have.
You try and sell one.
And actually what we really need is a lot more analytics-enabled LRSs, or a lot more analytics tools for putting, for dealing with data that's in an LRS. So this is one of the core contributions that we've been making, is really thinking about the analytics and what you can do with this data. Okay. But then again, back to what Leo was saying, for the analytics to make sense, you need to be putting an awful lot of thought into unifying that data and the profiles and the recipes. And so we've spent a lot of time thinking about how you can aggregate, this particular set of social media data for the purposes of our project, and that's something you're going to have to get very clear before the data hack, because what you'd need would be some set of profiles, recipes, ideas of what format the data's in your system in before you start thinking about how you can then pull it out and do something interesting with it. So you can easily degenerate into 2 days just thinking about data structures if you're not doing that.
But your work that you've done, Kirsty, on the CL recipe probably would be a very good start for the YouTube side of things anyway, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Okay. And the other thing that you could look at, the JISC project over in the UK has a huge amount of recipes and profiles for the higher education sort of use case that will be coming online hopefully at some point. So at the moment, when you go and look at their repository, which is also on GitHub, there's not much in it, but they're doing a lot of work around, what is a course, so those kinds of problems that you'll have when you try to integrate learning data from multiple institutions. So that's another very relevant one. There's more and more recipes available online, but what you do see is generally a lot of the development at the vendor side of things tends to be driven by very specific learning scenarios, and so there's less generic sort of data mapping going on. And I think this is actually something we really, in the higher education sort of community, need to really push, because in the end we need to be able to output students whose data makes sense in multiple contexts. It needs to make sense over 30 years, not just in one institution. So there's also the IMS caliper specification, which potentially gives a lot of richness around how data should be represented. But again, and it's built off activity streams too. But again, there's a lot of restrictions in terms of extending that one. So I think xAPI is the nice way to go there, but you need to be very aware of the other types of data models that are hitting the scene, because really you want these things to be highly interoperable. But yes, certainly the more analytics we have built off of xAPI, the more useful the specification will become.
Okay.
And there's not enough work going on there at the moment. So yeah.
So Kirsty, your project for viewers is a CLT or N?
So it's the Connected Learning Analytics Toolkit.
Toolkit.
CLA Toolkit, I don't know, is what we tend to call it. But
Look for the recipe. You'll start there. The JISC one was JISC's project on activity streams, or was it didn't have a project name?
There's a learning analytics infrastructure that JISC has been developing, which is essentially going to sort of roll out for all UK universities, and they're using xAPI as their low-level data structure, well, their low-level data spec. So they're doing a lot of work thinking about representation there too.
Okay. Well, we've used our time, and I don't want to go too long because I very much need people here at RMIT to watch this video. My colleague who sits behind me particularly needs to see this because she's a bit of a data wrangler and could probably make something happen here. But thanks very much for joining what is, I hope, the first of several meetups. And if you can pencil in October 24, if it's not a data hack, it'll be a discussion like this, but in live in person. So I don't know if your project has budget to travel to Melbourne. We don't have a project budget to travel up there, so yeah, Melbourne's the centre of the world. Yeah. But thanks for giving me this this discussion, Kirsty and Leo.
No worries, it was fun.
Okay. I'll stop the broadcast, but hang on.